America. Shock and awe at what was seen. About 40 to 50 years ago, communist propaganda described the horrors on American streets in a manner like this. Dozens of people, who have lost their human appearance, lie on the streets. Their bodies are emaciated, and their inflamed eyes are closed. These are heroin addicts. They are willing to commit any crime to secure a dose of the necessary substance. Otherwise, within hours, their life will turn into a hellish nightmare. Their entire body will be torn apart by unbearable pain, comparable only to medieval torture. Shootouts between competing gangs frequently erupt on the streets, and the death of an innocent bystander from a stray bullet is not uncommon. The streets are also overwhelmed with homeless people. What do people who have never lived or do not live in the U.S. associate with America? It turns out their perception of America is very much shaped by images from legendary movies, such as Home Alone. Well-kept streets lined with sturdy, large houses from the 1920s, where a happy, large family lives, a family that can not only maintain this home and pay substantial bills, but also afford to fly first class to Europe for a vacation. And the grand streets of New York, full of well-dressed, successful people, and a young Trump as the embodiment of the famed American dream. The reality, however, is somewhat different, or rather, radically different. Part 1. The Living Dead Districts. Philadelphia. This city is considered one of the most dangerous large cities in the U.S. In the 2000s, many violent crimes were committed there. Although the number has decreased since then, Philadelphia has not completely shaken its reputation as a crime-ridden city. One of its major problems is drug trafficking, especially heroin and fentanyl. On the outskirts of Philadelphia lies Kensington, a heroin ghetto. Hundreds of addicts lie in absurd poses on the streets, dealers openly sell doses, and if you dare to arrive by subway, you will be met by a heroin guide. A person who helps buy a dose and find a comfortable place to use it. But the phantasmagoria doesn't end there. A few blocks make up a real ghetto of living dead, but just 100 meters further, hipsters with dogs appear on the sidewalks, and drug dens are replaced by trendy cafes. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel as a token of gratitude. San Francisco. The real nightmare unfolds in the Tenderloin district. Even someone who has been to Kabul, with its grim crowds of desperate addicts under the stench-filled medieval bridge arches, might struggle to accept that an even more horrifying scene awaits them in the city with the enchanting name of San Francisco. Not long ago, visitors to the city lamented how hard it was to be tolerant toward the homeless. Yes, San Francisco is known for its homeless population. There are so many in the city center that it's impossible to walk more than a couple of blocks without encountering someone sleeping in dirty rags. But the homeless in the center are just the beginning. The true horrors lie in Tenderloin. People lie on the streets in their own filth, with syringes in hand, and aggression is rampant. Any resident of San Francisco can tell you a story of robberies in this area. Tenderloin is located right in the heart of San Francisco. Just steps away are the City Hall, conservatory, museums, libraries, and the headquarters of Twitter and Uber. Yet amid these centers of public life lies sheer hell. Despite being designated a historic district since 2008, Tenderloin is also known as the most dangerous and filthy part of San Francisco. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Filipino gang Bahala Gang, specializing in racketeering, drug trafficking, and contract killings, operated there. Now, smaller gangs dominate, mainly dealing drugs and trading stolen goods. Crimes such as theft, especially from parked cars, robbery, and aggravated assault are common in Tenderloin. Most of these crimes are drug-related. Drugs are sold openly on the streets in broad daylight. Not just the legalized marijuana in California, but all types, mainly crack, heroin, and amphetamines. The streets are literally covered in vomit and excrement, and people live on the streets in cardboard boxes. The reasons for the vast number of homeless are as follows. The rapid rise in housing prices due to the growth of the IT industry in San Francisco makes renting an apartment or even a room unaffordable for many, forcing them onto the streets. Some rental housing is subsidized by the government, but there isn't enough for everyone. Generous welfare benefits. The homeless receive numerous aids such as money, shelter, free food, etc. California's favorable climate allows living on the streets year-round. Since the 1950s, the U.S. government has stopped funding psychiatric hospitals, sending a large number of mentally ill people onto the streets. Some grim statistics. Experts refer to the ongoing crisis as the fourth wave of the opioid epidemic, affecting various social groups across the country. In 2021, the U.S. reached a grim milestone. For the first time, over 100,000 people died from drug overdoses in a single year nationwide. New York. The influx of homeless, mentally ill, and drug addicts has created a full-scale humanitarian crisis encountered by millions of tourists and office workers arriving in Midtown and adjacent high-traffic areas, wrote a city council member in a letter to the mayor asking for help, according to the New York Post. According to NYPD data, major crimes in the area rose by 71% as of 2024 compared to the previous year. Here's what it looks like in reality, not just on the dry pages of an official's letter. The grim areas of the West Side, where one can see the mentally ill, including addicts with lifeless eyes, frozen in odd poses, and some walking around with needles clutched in their fists, threatening to infect passers-by who quickly move away on 36th Street near the busy Penn Station. A weary security guard, refusing to give his name, might tell you how he sees homeless people using drugs day and night right in the courtyard of what was once the famous Midtown Holiday Inn on 8th Avenue. It's madness here. I see pregnant women injecting this poison into their veins, he says. Whole sections of the West Side, including the areas around Washington Square Park, the West 4th Street subway station in West Village, and the Garment District, are in an especially dire state. Homeless drug addicts do as they please. Police precincts in this area are overwhelmed with calls about open drug sales and use, property damage, threatening acts of physical and verbal intimidation, shoplifting, and more. Yet the police cannot arrest these marginalized individuals to assist local residents. Human rights activists argue that the proliferation of marginalized areas is due to, believe it or not, the war on drugs. Specifically, the methods used in this battle. Back in the 1980s, President Reagan declared the war on drugs, leading to police raids in impoverished neighborhoods predominantly inhabited by people of color. Cynical propaganda claimed that only rapists and drug dealers lived in these areas. As a result, many families were left fatherless, further impoverished, and the marginalized areas became even more so. This included neighborhoods like Harlem in New York. Part 2. Is there hope in the ghetto? The poor neighborhoods of American metropolises are mired in crime and social problems. Typically, ghettos are home to populations of a single ethnic origin, African Americans or Latin Americans. Often, these are people who came to the U.S. seeking work but could not adapt to the American way of life, with income levels and high rental prices preventing them from moving to more prosperous areas. The white population of the ghettos usually consists of drug addicts, prostitutes, alcoholics, criminals, and the homeless. Sometimes, the reality seems like a dystopian movie set. Windows are barred, buildings are covered in graffiti, and police and emergency services often do not respond to calls. On the streets, the unemployed and drug addicts roam, hoping to steal or rob an unsuspecting visitor of a few dollars. Outsiders are not welcome here and will be told to leave quickly. Marcy Houses, New York. The construction of public housing for the low-income population in northern Brooklyn was completed in the early 1950s. This area was named after the 11th governor of New York, William L. Marcy. The dreary complex consists of 27 six-story buildings with nearly 2,000 apartments in total, housing over 4,000 residents. Once, a Dutch mill stood here, but in 1945, the city administration bought the land and began construction. This nondescript brick complex was settled by immigrants and workers, mainly African Americans and Caribbean people. The area was always known for being dangerous. The rapper Jay-Z was born and raised in Marcy Houses and has mentioned this depressive place in his songs, recounting shootouts, drug dealers' daily lives, and police raids. Pruitt-Igoe, St. Louis. The construction of public housing for young and low-income families began in 1954. The project, designed by Minoru Yamasaki, the architect of the ill-fated Twin Towers in New York, involved 33 identical 11-story buildings with nearly 3,000 apartments. The area was named after Wendell O. Pruitt, an African-American World War II hero, and William Igoe, a white congressman. Initially, the plan was to segregate the buildings into colored and white, but racial segregation was abolished in the state, making the complex open to all low-income residents. Within a few years, the white residents left for the suburbs, turning Pruitt-Igoe into a new ghetto. Residents stopped paying for utilities, crime rates soared, elevators and ventilation systems broke down, and the plumbing failed, turning the buildings into slums. The police stopped responding to calls, leading to a communal catastrophe. Today, the situation has been resolved, and the buildings were demolished, with a school and military academy built in their place. Robert Taylor Homes, Chicago. One of the largest public housing projects turned into another dangerous ghetto by the 1970s. Named after African-American activist Robert Taylor, the complex was located in South Chicago and consisted of 28 identical high-rise buildings. The first residents moved into these low-income homes in 1962. Instead of the planned 11,000 residents, over 27,000 African Americans moved in. The situation in this ghetto worsened every year. Soon, Robert Taylor Homes in South Chicago faced typical problems of poor neighborhoods, organized crime, drug trafficking, poverty, territorial disputes among local gangs, and outbreaks of violence. One day, 28 people were killed in a shootout in the area, which became the last straw for authorities. The police carried out several operations involving special forces, and bulldozers were brought in to clear the area. By 2007, more than 2,000 low-rise houses, several commercial premises, retail stores, and 7 cultural sites had been built on the site. Despite all efforts, the tense situation in South Chicago persists to this day. Magnolia Projects, New Orleans. This ghetto was located in central New Orleans. The project began in a typical fashion. The first phase of public housing construction was completed in 1941, and in 1955, the area expanded northward with 6 more blocks added. The development, officially called the C.J. Peet Projects but colloquially known as Magnolia due to the street of the same name, was initially populated exclusively by African Americans during segregation. In the 1980s and 1990s, funding dried up and the area fell into decline. The nearest hospital closed, crime rates surged, and aggressive street gangs appeared. The situation escalated, and in some years, the ghetto set records for violence and murders. Magnolia projects could rival entire cities with unfavorable conditions regarding crime. Detroit. The shame and pain of the U.S. Detroit is not a ghetto in the traditional sense. Once the fourth largest city in the U.S. and the capital of the auto industry, it began to suffer from economic problems in the mid-20th century. The automotive giants faced difficulties, the oil crisis hit hard, and local factories could no longer compete with Japanese and European models. Factories closed, and most residents left. Today, most homes in Detroit are abandoned. Many owners try to sell properties at minimal prices, but there are no buyers. In the 1980s, up to 800 fires occasionally broke out as locals burned abandoned homes. In 2013, the city declared bankruptcy. Most buildings have already been demolished or are slated for demolition. In today's reality, for every victory the authorities achieve over these appalling problems, there are two setbacks. A severe affliction continues to eat away at the body of this great nation. These issues impact both the economic situation in the U.S. and its position on the world stage. Many opportunities will remain unrealized until the monster with many tentacles, named poverty, crime, depression, and despair, is at least tamed, if not defeated. The 47th President of the United States will have to work hard, employing the entire bureaucratic machine. Otherwise, the consequences will be irreversible.